Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tools, the travel company led by reporters. As the death toll in Gaza mounts, there is a threat further to the north. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has threatened to launch a major attack on Israel as the IDF launches a full ground invasion of Gaza. There are threats also further afield in Syria, Iraq and Yemen. But do Iran and Hezbollah really want to get involved, lesser known Lebanon? Nicholas Blanford is one of the world's leading experts on Hezbollah and is based in Beirut. Hello and welcome, Nick.
Hello, Nick. Good to be with you.
Yeah, good to be with you here. We are, because we know what the signal's sometimes like in Beirut and Lebanon, we're going to stick to sound only for this, so that the line is crisp and clear at the moment, which is great. Just to start with, Nick, what has been happening on the blue line? What's been happening on that border between Israel and Lebanon since the conflict started?
Well, we've seen a steady escalation of fighting between Hezbollah and the Israelis, and this kicked off on October the 8th, so the day after the Hamas raid into southern Syria. And it began with a very pro-forma attack, a mortar-round attack by Hezbollah into an area called the Sheba Farms, which is an Israeli-occupied strip of mountainside along Lebanon's southeast border. And it's been a venue of attacks in the past, and I think everyone was expecting this. Then the following day, October the 9th, we had a group from Palestinian Islamic Jihad who tried to cross the border into Israeli territory. There was a firefight. An Israeli lieutenant colonel was killed in the fighting. The Israelis shelled back into Lebanon, and then Hezbollah got more formally engaged in action along the Blue Line. The Blue Line is the United Nations term for a line corresponding to the Lebanon-Israel border. So essentially, we've seen fighting almost every single day. The fighting escalated about 5 or 6 days ago when the Israelis began to move into the Gaza Strip. And for the most part, Hezbollah is attacking military targets along the border. These are Israeli army border posts. They're using anti-tank missiles rather than mortar rounds. And I think the reason for that is anti-tank missiles are a far more accurate weapon than mortar rounds, and therefore you minimize the possibility of causing Israeli civilian casualties with your attacks. So both sides are operating within certain rules of the game at the moment. It hasn't spilled out of control. There's been a steady escalation in the intensity of attacks. It's a very dangerous situation. It could yet spill out of control. But after 3 weeks of this, it seems pretty evident that the Israelis don't want to have a new front opening up in their north, and Hezbollah's not willing to go all the way to all out with Israel at this stage, I should add.
I'll come back to that possibility of escalation and also the other groups involved in a second. But just what kind of damage could Hezbollah do to Israel? I mean, I think we are well aware of Israel's capabilities, but tell us a bit more about the threat from Hezbollah to Israel.
Well, if Hezbollah was to get fully engaged in a shooting war with Israel, it would make what is happening in Gaza and southern Israel look like a walk in the park. Hezbollah is a much larger, much more formidable military organization than Hamas. Their key weapon is probably the sub-ballistic precision-guided missiles that have a range in excess of 300 kilometers. They carry 500-kilogram warheads. That's a very big bang. And they can fire them to within 10, 20 meters of their targets. So if they were to unleash their rocket arsenal alone, that would cover the entire territory of Israel. They would be hitting military targets. They would be hitting infrastructure targets. And it would mean that Israel essentially was shut down for the duration of the conflict. Nobody's going to work, nobody's going to school, nobody's going to university. And that's just the missile component. Hezbollah also has a fleet of drones, weaponized drones. They have anti-ship missiles with a range that would essentially allow Hezbollah to impose a naval blockade all along the Israeli coastline. So there would be no maritime shipping coming into Israel at a time of war. Obviously, there'd be no civilian aviation traffic either. Ben Gurion Airport in the center of Israel would probably be one of the primary targets. And then you have the actual fighting force, maybe 60,000, in many cases, battle-hardened fighters who fought in Syria over the last decade. And these guys will essentially do what Hamas did, but on a larger scale, and that is cross the blue line into Israeli territory. The Israelis have actually moved the civilian population out of a strip about 5 kilometers deep in northern Israel. So Hezbollah has lost the element of surprise to that extent. And the Israelis, of course, have beefed up their troop numbers in the north as well. But they still have the capacity to move en masse into Israel and to cause sabotage and cause total chaos wherever they go. But I should also point out that if things kick off in a serious manner between Hezbollah and Israel, the likelihood of the war going regional is very strong. And that means that the Syria front would open up. It would mean that Iranian-backed groups from Iraq, from Syria, would get involved in the fight. The Houthis in Yemen have already got involved. They've been firing missiles and drones towards southern Israel. All of them have been shot down so far. But we could expect the Houthis to get involved. The West Bank could explode, and maybe even the Iranians would get directly involved. So a decision by Israel to go to war against Hezbollah, a unilateral decision, is a very tough call to make.
Okay, it's obviously, events, dear boy, could sort of develop, but you can see there's restraint at the moment. Can you just say what's Nasrallah, the spiritual, the leader of Hezbollah, has been saying? What's the signaling that has been given so far?
Well, Hassan Nasrallah has said absolutely nothing, and everyone has been scratching their heads why he's remained silent these past 3 weeks. He's normally quite vocal. I mean, we expect a speech from him at least once every couple of weeks or so. And I think it's deliberate. I think his silence is in part not to commit himself to a course of action that he can't back down from later on down the road. And we have had some comments from Hezbollah officials, and they've been full of fire and thunder, but they've been fairly vague, the kind of warnings, if this happens, this could happen, rather than more definitive statements. And also there's a psychological element to all this. When he's silent and Nasrallah is essentially determining whether Lebanon goes to war or not. So everyone wants to know what he's thinking. But the longer he stays silent, the more people keep guessing. And of course, that's on the Israeli side as well as the Lebanese side. So I think there's purpose behind his silence. Hezbollah released a very enigmatic short video clip a few days ago, which showed Nasrallah with his back to the camera, walking briefly down a corridor past a picture of Hezbollah. And everyone's been trying to rack their brains to figure out what all that means. But I think, again, it's just Hezbollah are playing mind games with their Israeli enemy. So we'll have to wait and see. He's going to speak on Friday. And unusually, Hezbollah gave 5 days advance notice that the leader was going to be speaking. So everyone is now waiting with bated breath to see what Hassan Nasrallah has to say.
I suppose from their point of view, there's a risk of loss of credibility. They've said that there's this pro-Palestinian alliance. They're going to stand up for Hamas. And if Israel goes, various people have said if Israel goes full tilt in Gaza, there's an obligation on others to get involved. And that sort of seems to be implicit in what some people have said so far. So it would seem to me if Hezbollah continues to sit on the sidelines, isn't there a risk of loss of credibility?
Well, it has to be said that there's several Hamas officials have grumbled in public that the Iranians and Hezbollah are not doing enough. We expect more from them. But this is a very difficult call, not just for Hezbollah, but for Iran. Iran ultimately is going to decide whether Hezbollah gets more fully engaged or not. And for Iran, Hezbollah is a key component of its deterrence architecture. So in other words, anybody that's contemplating launching an attack on Iran, whether it's going after the nuclear facilities, whether they want to decapitate the regime, they have to take into account what is Hezbollah going to do from Lebanon. If the Iranians were to commit Hezbollah to a full-scale war with Israel, irrespective of the outcome of the war, Hezbollah will take a battering. I mean, Lebanon will be turned into a car park, and Hezbollah will be severely damaged. And there's no guarantee that Hezbollah would be able to rearm, re-equip, and repair itself as quickly as it did after the last war in 2006 to continue serving as a powerful deterrent for Iran. So I'm not sure. Logic tells me that the Iranians won't fully commit Hezbollah into the fight for the sake of Hamas in Gaza, even if it means that Hamas is going to be crushed, essentially. The Israelis talk about eradicating Hamas entirely. You can't eradicate an ideology. You can certainly weaken it as a fighting force, but it could always potentially rebuild again in the future, if not in Gaza, elsewhere.
So, I'd love to come back to that in a second, that thought about Hamas, but sticking with Iran, so essentially Hezbollah, the more crucial point is that Hezbollah is really a deterrent in terms of Israel and Iran. So, for example, if Israel were to try and launch a strike on Iran, Hezbollah is there to deter that.
Exactly. And there's been a kind of a balance of terror along the Lebanon-Israel border since 2006, because Hezbollah has grown so much since the end of the war, and the arsenal it has now dwarfs what it had 17 years ago. So the Israelis they understand fully that the implications of getting involved in a shooting match with Hezbollah. And by the same token, Hezbollah has been quite careful along the Lebanon-Israel border not to antagonize the Israelis in case it leads to a war that, frankly, neither side really wants at the moment.
Yeah, so we've just got a map up, just reminding people of that, the blue line, as it's called, which we've taken people to on numerous tours, and actually on both sides of the border, and the Sheba Farms areas, that grey area, as you can see. So this is the area where there's a sort of the risk of fighting spilling over, as it were, but at the moment being contained. The Houthis are are a group that it seems slightly odd to be. I mean, what threat can the Houthis pose to Israel? I mean, it surprised me that they have been able to fire missiles towards Iran, but I suppose it's a threat that is not as significant as Hezbollah, and they're being used for a reason.
Yes, I mean, I think the Houthis don't really have much to lose by firing some drones or missiles in the direction of Israel. It's fairly unlikely that the projectiles will actually make it to Israeli territory. You've got the Israeli air defense systems in place, and you've got the US Navy sailing in the Red Sea at the moment. And I think it was the US Navy that shot down the first salvo a week or so ago. But the Houthis are doing their bit. They're backed by Iran. I don't think they worry too much about Israeli jets flying over Yemen and bombing them. So it's more symbolic than anything else, having the Houthis join in.
Yeah, and I guess there's no government there that's responsible that would get hammered as a result of it. So it's a different equation to Lebanon.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Lebanon's got a lot to lose. Gets dragged into a conflict, particularly as the country is, entering its fifth year of a very grave economic, financial, and political crisis. The last thing the Lebanese need is a devastating war.
Could we just talk about that a bit more too? Because that, I think, possibly people are less aware. We know that Hezbollah has got a significant, military presence, but it's also got a considerable political presence within Lebanon, and that having a full-scale war would damage its, long-term interests there too.
Yes, well, I think the Hezbollah is very cognizant of the fact that no one is going to thank Hezbollah for dragging Lebanon into a highly destructive war, particularly at this time. And that includes its own Shia constituency. So over the last 3 weeks, we've had some 20,000 plus people living in South Lebanon, mainly Shias, evacuating their homes, moving further north to get out of the front line. And this has to have a kind of a breaking effect on Hezbollah's actions. But ultimately, Hezbollah is answerable to Iran. And if Iran's calculus changes and the Iranians suddenly think, you know what, we're never going to have a better time to go after Israel than now, and they instruct Hezbollah to go full on into a full war with Israel, then Hezbollah will do it. That is a discipline that binds the leadership of Iran to Hezbollah. But it will come at a terrible price in terms of the aftermath of the war. I mean, in 2006, you had the Gulf countries stepping in with billions of dollars of reconstruction aid to help repair the damage after the month-long war that year. But you're not going to have that next time round. Nobody's going to come to Lebanon's assistance. And I think there will be grave repercussions politically in the country. You already have a sizable segment of the Christian community who got fed up with Hezbollah, and they want to break away. They want to form their own Christian enclave north of Beirut, up in the mountains, and have done with South Lebanon, have done with the Bekaa Valley, and have done with Hezbollah and the Iranians. And I think that sentiment will grow much stronger in the aftermath of the devastating war. And it's also going to accelerate the emigration of Lebanese. In the last 4 years, we've seen a lot of Lebanese leaving the country. They've just given up. They've lost all their savings when the banks collapsed, and they're starting new lives elsewhere. And I think that will also accelerate in the aftermath of the war.
Nick, can you briefly recap? We've had the Beirut port explosion, the banking crisis, even the bank governor. Just run us through those the key things that happened over the last 4 years.
Well, yes. I mean, it began really, the crunch point was October of 2019. And this is when basically the Lebanon has been running, the central bank and the banks, private commercial banks, have been running effectively a huge Ponzi scheme for years. So to attract revenues, the government would have placed huge interest rates on money coming to the central bank. So the banks, private banks, commercial banks, took advantage of this and threw the depositors' monies into the central bank and received, obviously, the high interest rates. But because the governments here tend to be inept and corrupt and wasteful spending and so on, they continued to run out of money, and suddenly they had no money to pay back the banks. So the banks in October imposed a freeze on everybody's bank accounts, and that triggered the Thawra, the revolution, which lasted, it brought people of all different stripes, backgrounds, sectarian backgrounds, out into the streets, basically saying enough is enough. We've had enough of the corruption. We want the government gone. And this continued for the winter of 2019 into early 2020. Then, of course, COVID kicked in, and that effectively shut down the revolution. And then in August of 2020, we had this massive explosion in Beirut port, several tons of, 1,000 tons of ammonium nitrate detonated, self-detonated, and it caused immense damage to a large chunk of East Beirut, killed over 200 people. So that was yet another blow to the Lebanese. And more recently, the President Michel Aoun, stepped down a year ago at the end of his 6-year term, but the politicians can't agree on a new head of state. So right now we don't have a president. The government is operating in a limited caretaker capacity because there is no president. The governor of the central bank, who was the architect of the collapse, and who's been sanctioned by various European countries, and there's under arrest warrants for him, he left office. He left the central bank at the end of July. He's living quietly somewhere in Lebanon at the moment. So there's an acting head of the central bank. The army commander, the commander of the Lebanese army, is due to step down at the mandatory age of 60, of retirement age, in January. And to put this into context, the Lebanese army is really the one national institution that holds the country together. And we now have a risk that in January, when the army commander steps down, there's no one to replace him. Because again, the politicians bickering amongst themselves can't agree on who to nominate. So this is where we're at, and it's a pretty miserable situation to be in.
So Lebanon's certainly not in any state to deal with any kind of war, and it's got enormous problems of its own. To quote Donald Rumsfeld, are there any sort of known unknowns? Can you think of situations, whether in Lebanon or possibly Syria or Iraq, where you've got other militant groups that could provoke a situation. I'm thinking of groups that are allied to Iran but might not be under its control or as obedient as they might be.
Well, I think they've all been behaving themselves so far. Hezbollah has been carrying out the bulk of attacks along the blue line. But we have had Hamas firing rockets into Israel. Islamic Jihad has been involved. There's a group here called the Jamaat Islamiyah. It's a Sunni fundamentalist group. They've been involved in one or two attacks. The Syria front has been surprisingly quiet. I'm told that President Assad is very unwilling to have the Syria front, which would be in southeast Syria, essentially, adjacent to the Golan Heights, to have that opened up. And there seems to be some friction between him and the Iranians over this. But frankly, the Iranians are the power in Syria. It's not President Assad. And southern Syria is packed full of Syrian, Iraqi, Afghani groups, Shia groups that are backed by the Iranians. So we could see that activated at some point. But I think that it's difficult for rogue actors really to get a foot in to do something that could spoil it. It's pretty well controlled overall.
Okay, and they're not. Nobody is compared to. Doesn't have the same arms as Hezbollah. Hezbollah's the only sort of major threat there. Do put questions down in the Q&A box, please. I think Alan Livingston's got a question. You just I think we've touched on it just now, Alan, but maybe we can put a bit more light on it. And then I think we'd like to talk a bit about Hamas and how you assess Hamas's strengths militarily in a moment, Nick. But go ahead, Alan, with your question.
Thank you, Nicholas. Hello, Nicholas. It's nice to see you or talk to you again. I had asked a question and you sort of answered it already, and that was the position of the Lebanese military. How they might be getting involved. Also, I know there's a lot of smuggling of weapons from Syria into Lebanon. Is that continuing? And have you seen any major increase in weapons being smuggled down to Hezbollah coming through the Syrian route?
Thanks, Alan. Good to hear from you. Yes, well, the LAF is in a tricky position at the moment because, Hezbollah is leading the fighting down in the south, and the LAF is left to pick up the pieces, in some cases, literally. The Israelis have been firing a lot of phosphorus rounds into the border district in South Lebanon, ostensibly to burn the undergrowth, to deny Hezbollah ground cover. And this, of course, has led to crops being burned. We're just coming to the end of the olive picking season. So farmers are rather desperate, seeing their olive trees going up in flames and tobacco fields going up in flames as well. So the Lebanese army have been trying to help out on these, if you like, civil defense kind of issues, helping put out fires, helping evacuate people out of the confrontation zones and so on. But, a big question is that if things go big between Hezbollah and the Israelis, what is the Lebanese army going to do? In 2006, they basically did nothing, and they just sat in the barracks and waited for it to finish. If the Israelis were to stage a major ground incursion into Lebanon, which they probably have to do in the event of full-on war, what would the LAF do? I think the LAF would fight, and they will be crushed. Obviously, they're nothing like as strong as the Israelis. And in 2006, the Americans did lean on the Israelis to spare the Lebanese army because they recognize the Lebanese army is the kind of the guarantor for national stability in Lebanon. In the event of a new war and a major war, I don't know if the Americans, who've invested over $2 billion in the LAF over the past decade and a half, I can imagine the Americans would put some pressure on the Israelis to spare the Lebanese army. But that would also be up to the Lebanese army. If they confront an Israeli ground confrontation, then the Israelis will fight back. On the weapons smuggling, it's ongoing. I can't imagine really if there's any less space left in Lebanon for more missiles for Hezbollah. It's been an ongoing process for such a long time. I think the Israelis are watching very carefully the routes that go across the border. It's a very rugged border between Lebanon and Syria, mainly mountainous. But it's probably no surprise that the Israelis have twice, I think, struck Damascus airport and Aleppo airport up in northern Syria, cratering the runways to prevent Iranian flights coming in, carrying more weapons and supplies for Hezbollah. But Hezbollah has a massive arsenal, so I don't think they're running short by any means at all.
Yeah, they don't need to fly in stuff now just because the conflict is taking place in Gaza. The stocks are full. Nick, can we talk about the connections? I mean, just looking at the IDF going into Gaza, and this is less about Hezbollah, but what do you think the IDF can expect? And what do you know about what have you gleaned about the kind of training that they've had from Iran, the influence that the Iranians might have had?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit opaque because we don't know exactly what the Israelis are going to be walking into, but we can guess. So clearly Hamas has had years to prepare its defenses against a ground invasion, and they have a massive underground network of tunnels and bunkers which they can exploit to their advantage. The Israelis announced this morning that they lost 10 soldiers dead, 17 wounded, 4 seriously, just in an operation last night. And this is right at the beginning. So I would expect Hamas wouldn't have had the same level of training as Hezbollah. They don't really have the space for it. I mean, you can have individual Hamas fighters getting out through the Rafah crossing or getting into Egypt and heading off to Lebanon for specialized training, or Iran, but they don't have big training camps with the full facilities that Hezbollah has here in Lebanon. But they have the advantage of knowing the ground intimately. They will be using roadside bombs, which are very effective in a kind of a built-up area. They will have them disguised as rocks or hidden beneath rubble. And these bombs tend to be directional. So it's a bit like a shotgun blast, blasting out ball bearings into approaching Israeli soldiers. And Hezbollah was the pioneer of the roadside bomb tactic back in the 90s when the Israelis were occupying South Lebanon. So I'd certainly expect to see that. They will use anti-tank missiles. They have the same sort of anti-tank missiles as Hezbollah, which are, again, effective in a kind of a close, confined combat zone, which Gaza is, particularly when it's full of buildings, collapsed buildings and rubble, which Hamas can use to stage ambushes, to hide out in. They use the tunnel networks so that they can pop up behind Israeli lines and attack them from the rear, which I think they've already been doing. So this kind of urban combat is extremely difficult. And although the Israelis have a technological advantage, it is reduced greatly when it's basically one soldier against one fighter in a dense urban environment.
Marty, Ryan, we'll come to your question in just a second. But before we do that, Nick, what kind of time length can you put on this conflict? I mean, I know we can't sort of second guess what the Israelis are going to do, but the question is, what can they do? We've already said in the beginning of this conversation, destroying Hamas as a force may not be possible. Hamas is a movement; it's an ideological-based movement, and it's like getting rid of communism. It's not going to disappear. It's going to be there after you've demolished all the buildings. I mean, you might have to, and nobody's suggesting that they should wipe out the entire population. I'm just trying to work out what kind of objective do you think is possible? What do you see?
Well, everyone's asking that question, and I think the Israelis have made a mistake, the same mistake they made in 2006, is to launch into a war without thinking about the end game. As General Petraeus once said, how does this end? When talking about the invasion of Iraq back in 2003, how does this end? I'm not sure that I think the Israelis went into this without answering that question. And the shock of the the Hamas attack and the atrocities committed. I mean, 1,400 Israelis being slaughtered in a single day is, obviously unprecedented. And I think their initial actions were driven by rage and a sense of retaliation, revenge, and then perhaps calmer heads prevailed. I mean, the Israeli defense minister was proposing in the Israeli cabinet a preemptive strike on Hezbollah, which would have been a disaster for Israel. Fortunately, Netanyahu vetoed that. But it's hard to see how this is going to end. There is a lot of concern at the moment that the Israelis may even expel the Gaza population into Sinai, into Egypt, and prevent them coming back. And then presumably Gaza will be resettled once again. The settlers in Gaza originally left in 2005. I think Secretary Blinken is talking, he's heading back to Israel today or tomorrow, and he's talking about having an improved Palestinian administration, Palestinian Authority to take over Gaza once the dust settles. But it's very hard to see how that's going to happen. And you're right. I mean, you can't eradicate an ideology like Hamas. So Hamas will still be there in some shape or form when this is all over. And in terms of duration, really difficult to tell. I mean, the Israelis are talking about months. So you could have a scenario where the initial offensive is over in a matter of weeks, but Israeli troops stay on the ground, and then you have a kind of a low-level insurgency as the surviving Hamas fighters stage hit-and-run attacks against the Israelis. The Israelis try to find them and eradicate them, and that could go on for a long, long time. I mean, that's almost then like a South Lebanon situation when the Israelis are occupying and Hezbollah were doing their own hit-and-run attacks back in the 90s.
And then I suppose it's about what political room there is for the Israelis to sustain that conflict, both domestically but also internationally, with pressure from the United States, but also Arab nations saying to the US, this can't go on. Our populations are not going to be happy to continue for so long. Or perhaps not. Maybe the Israelis can be oblivious to that. And as they stayed in Lebanon for some time, just stick it out.
Well, I mean, I think that the international opinion towards Israel is not what it was 20, 30 years ago. There's a lot more criticism now. Typically, Israel is granted a window of a week, maybe 2 weeks. So far, it's 3 weeks and counting, where they can pretty much do as they please. And then when the casualty count among civilians grows too high, then the international community begins to step in and to look for some kind of diplomatic resolution. That diplomatic resolution may be just beginning now, but it's going to take a long time, particularly with the Israeli blood is up. Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a very difficult situation to finish with.
Okay, we'll come back to those political questions in just a second. Well, let's take Marty Ryan's question. I think, Marty, we've partly answered this, but let's have another look at it. Marty, go ahead.
Well, this, as you had mentioned, seems like an opportunity for Iran to make good on its rhetoric about destroying Israel. And I'm wondering, what's actually holding Iran back?
Well, there's a split in Iran, isn't there, Nick? I mean, we've seen very conciliatory statements coming from the Iran's foreign minister when I think he was actually at the UN in New York recently, and then other statements coming out essentially saying that they don't want a fully fledged war with Israel, but at the same time, hardliners voicing something, being a lot more sort of active about it.
Well, I think, the Iranians oppose Israel ideologically, of course. But I think that the leaders of Iran are coldly rational people. And they could open the front and we have a full-scale regional war. And yes, Israel will get battered, but there's no guarantee that Israel will be crushed, that it will be completely defeated, and that the Israelis decide, that's it, we're out of here, we're giving this land back to the Palestinians. I mean, I don't see that happening. Israel would survive, and the Iranians would have lost a lot of their deterrence. So Hezbollah will take a mauling in a war, as I was saying earlier on. And I think that the calculus could change, but the logic tells me that the Iranians are not willing to get involved in a full-scale war. And in a way, the proof is in the pudding, because we're 3 weeks into this conflict, and Hezbollah is doing its thing along the blue line. It's needling the Israelis, but they haven't committed themselves fully into the conflict. If the Iranians really wanted to go after Israel, then they would have ignited Hezbollah to go across the border with Lebanon at the same moment Hamas was doing the same thing down in Gaza on October the 7th. Now the element of surprise is lost. So yes, Hezbollah can still do a lot of damage in Israel, but I think the fact that we haven't seen them escalate to this a state of full war with Israel in the last 3 weeks is quite telling. Now that can change. The Israeli calculus may change. There was talk yesterday from their security minister saying publicly that we have to deal with Hezbollah once we've dealt with Hamas, which is a very dangerous comment, because Hezbollah will listen to that and think, well, in that case, why wait for them to finish with Hamas? Why don't we go after them now? So it's still a very precarious situation. But in short, I think the Iranians are coolly or coldly rational when it comes to these things.
I suppose, Nick, it's an existential question for everyone. So Iran wants to keep Hezbollah back because it's a deterrent when dealing with Israel. But equally, if Hamas is wiped out or seen to be massively crushed, that's worrying for Hezbollah, isn't it? I mean, because then the focus is on them, surely.
Well, this is what people are questioning now, that because we are really in uncharted waters over the last 3 weeks, that as the Israeli security minister said yesterday, when we finish with the Hamas, we go after Hezbollah. 4 weeks ago, I would have said no way would Israel launch a preemptive attack on Hezbollah, because the backlash would be too severe for any Israeli prime minister or government to survive.
I mean, Israel is saying never again. They didn't receive this threat coming. It's happened to them, and they've got to, they will never put themselves in this vulnerable position again. So with that kind of mentality, you can see how fragile they are, and perhaps wanting to take measures that are very different.
Yes, but the thing is, Hamas is not Hezbollah, and the Israelis have been watching Hezbollah grow in size, acquire all this new weaponry over the last 17 years, but there's basically been calm in South Lebanon, northern Israel. The Israelis living in the north have been able to go about their business, shopping, schools, all that kind of thing, even though the threat from the north is getting stronger and stronger. But if you go after that threat, then you're going to get the backlash. And as I was saying earlier on, Israel is going to get battered and it's going to stop functioning. And apart from the physical damage and loss of life, both military and civilian, the economy is going to go into free fall, the Israeli economy. So, when they finished with Hamas, they'll have to think long and hard. Also, whether the world would tolerate Israel going immediately after Hezbollah, after causing all this level of destruction and loss of life in Gaza. Because what happened in Gaza is going to be a drop in the ocean compared to what will happen to Lebanon.
Okay. Let's shift. I mean, there's so many unknowns here, but let's presume that the conflict at some stage comes to an end. There has to be some kind of search for a political settlement or a new order, security order, if you like, as well as a political order. So let's come to those kind of questions. So let's take a question from Alan Livingston first, and then Chris Evans. So go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, second question here. You said the Gulf states will not be major rebuilders of the devastation in this war. What role do you think they will be playing in Gaza after the fighting ends? And also, Saudi is so involved with its 2030 plan but they need stability in the region for it to be successful. So what role do you think the Saudis will ultimately be playing in Gaza and in this war?
Yeah, it's a good question, Alan. I mean, I would expect the Gulf to help out with Gaza. I think that the public sentiment across the region would compel them to, come up with some kind of grand Marshall Plan to rebuild Gaza in tandem with some kind of new political structure for Gaza, whatever that may be. And I would expect the Saudis to get involved in this to a greater or lesser degree. I mean, all the talk before October the 7th was about a reconciliation process between the Saudis and the Israelis. And there was a lot of chatter, both in Israel, the US and Saudi Arabia, that things were drawing closer and closer. This attack by Hamas and the war on Gaza has put an end to that. I mean, it could be resuscitated down the road, but I would imagine that for now, when things calm down in Gaza, the Saudis will be, their main priority will be to show their support for the Palestinians rather than to go and immediately cozy up with Israelis again. So I'd expect the Gulf countries to step in with money that will go to Gaza and not to Lebanon.
Okay. Can I ask you one quick question here, a follow-up? The follow-up is Qatari, the political leadership of Hamas is in Qatari. I noticed today they brokered a release where 500 nationals of other people in Gaza of other nationalities are being able to escape. Will Qatari do anything with the Hamas leadership if the Hamas military leadership is destroyed in the fighting in Gaza?
Well, I don't think the Qatari leadership will do anything with the Hamas politicians who are living in Doha and living in Qatar. I mean, they're not going to turn against them, I don't think. Even if the Hamas military wing in Gaza is crushed, Qatar has been playing a very influential role because they have relations with the Israelis. They have good relations, obviously, with the Americans, and they have good relations and long-standing relations with Hamas. So they're playing an important role to try to broker humanitarian relief for Gaza, to get the foreign nationals out. They've been able to get out, I think, 200 or 300 wounded people into hospitals in Egypt as well. So I think they'll continue playing that role, but I don't see them necessarily turning against Hamas.
Have wounded been allowed to cross the border? I wasn't aware of that.
Yes, I think along with the foreign nationals, I think there was 100, 200, maybe 300 wounded were allowed through the Rafah crossing in the south.
That's just happened.
This morning, yes.
Okay. I didn't know that. Let's take a question then, focusing on that border too. Chris Evans, you've got a question. Chris, you need to open your microphone. Okay. There you
go. Hello, Nick. Can you cast some light on how has Hamas's arsenal been supplied, given there is only the land border with the North Sinai Governorate?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the network of tunnels that Hamas has do extend into Egypt. And this is the main way of smuggling not just weapons, but commercial goods into Gaza. There have been attempts in the past to bring in weapons by sea, which is obviously very difficult. The Israeli Navy maintains a blockade of the Gaza coastline. But there were occasions when they would put weapons in semi-submersible bags, basically bags that would sink to just below the waterline, and then frogmen would swim out and drag them in. But also they do manufacture a lot of the weapons themselves. So the precursor elements for explosives, for rocket tubing and so on, could get smuggled in from Egypt. And then the systems are assembled in Gaza in workshops.
And it's the use of paragliders. I suppose when you keep people in that kind of situation, they become very resourceful.
Well, I think that was demonstrated by their rockets. I mean, originally there used to be a Qassam rocket, which was short range, not particularly accurate, but they've grown more skilled. They've been able to build larger systems now, systems that can reach Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, even Haifa, which I'm not sure how much the distance in miles or kilometers, but Haifa is up in northern Israel, not far from the border with Lebanon, and obviously Gaza is in the south. So yes, desperation breeds resourcefulness.
Nick, I'm going to ask you a question. It's slightly unfair because it's not really your area of expertise, but I'm just thinking of that balance within the Palestinian leadership. Hamas has been tremendously popular in the West Bank, largely because it's not in government. The PA is incredibly unpopular. So I'm just trying to think about where things, in terms of, at the same time, ordinary Palestinians, and particularly in Gaza, you've already seen pictures of people complaining about what Hamas has done. I'm just wondering when the sort of dust settles, who has the leadership of the Palestinians?
Good question. I mean, it probably won't be Hamas if Hamas is being greatly weakened by war. But the Palestinian Authority...
So just to stick with that, you think they will be greatly weakened no matter what?
Well, that's inevitable, I think. I mean, the Israelis are bringing the full weight of their firepower onto the organization. And it's inevitable that Hamas is going to take a beating. But again, like we were saying earlier on, you can't eradicate an ideology, so Hamas can spring back at some point. But militarily, for now, they will take a beating. What emerges after this is going to be interesting to see. And I think some of the talk coming out from the US is a new kind of Palestinian authority, whatever that means. President Abbas, he's an elderly gentleman. He's not well liked. He's not popular. He's seen as corrupt, ineffective, and in cahoots with the Israeli occupiers. Hamas has been gaining ground in the West Bank lately, and you've seen a rise of new militant groups in the West Bank. Some of them backed by the Iranians. The Iranians are trying to spread their influence into the West Bank as well. So it's a very febrile ground in the West Bank. And predicting what may emerge is really, really difficult.
Very difficult. Okay. Nick, just a word about you and your situation. We've had many people who travel with you, and so they'd like to know too. During this time, already Lebanon in a very difficult economic situation, the power cuts were numerous. What is life like for you and your family with the possibility of the war spreading as well? What precautions do you take? What's your family doing?
Well, we're doing what we normally do. So my two children are at university here in Beirut. My wife works and I do my work as well. Nothing has changed on that front. There is a strong level of apprehension hovering over the country. The threat of war is like a sword of Damocles that's hanging over all our heads. I live in a Christian part of Beirut, East Beirut. So, we were heavily affected by the Beirut port explosion. Our apartment was very heavily damaged. But in the event of a war, where I live will probably be spared. There'll be other parts of Beirut will be flattened, essentially the Shia-populated areas where Hezbollah has offices and headquarters and so on. We're fortunate enough to have a chalet up in the mountains, in quite a remote area. And my plan, if things go really bad here, is to stock up on tinned food and dried goods and head for the hills and sit it out until it's over.
Cool, yeah. And the other thought I've had over the past few days and weeks is thinking of those UN troops on the Blue Line. I remember being with you, we visited that Ghanaian battalion along the border. I suppose they're spending a lot of their time hunkered down in their bunkers.
Well, you remember, Nick, that their position was right next door to an Israeli border post, and that Israeli border post has been hit multiple times by Hezbollah anti-tank missiles in the last 3 weeks. So yes, the UNIFIL guys are spending a lot of time in the bomb shelters, in the bunkers at the moment. And you've got 10,000 peacekeepers down there, and there's not an awful lot they can do to influence the situation. So the work they're doing now is helping alongside the Lebanese army with evacuations. They've been assisting Lebanese civil defense with trying to put out some of the brush fires. They have a channel of communications, what they call the tripartite system, between Lebanese army and Israeli army, and the UNIFIL is the arbiter, the moderator between the two. So messages can be sent to try to calm down. If there are flare-ups or misunderstandings, there is a channel of communication to calm things down. But UNIFIL really is powerless, and if it does kick off into a full-scale war, you're going to have 10,000 foreigners who are going to be trapped down there and hostage to the whims of the conflict.
No, and you've just reminded me that Ghanaian battalion, Ghanbat as they call themselves, is literally their fence. They're right up against the wall of the Israeli position. They couldn't be closer. So I imagine when the missiles are flying, it's right over their heads, if not in their camp too. Not a nice situation to be in at all. Nick, I think we've covered all our bases. To use an expression. It's been a wonderful talk. I think we've covered it all. Thank you very much indeed for your time, and I hope you and your family remain safe, and that we'll be back in touch with you again before long.
Thanks, Nick. I've enjoyed it very much, and thank you for all the good questions.